The town of Wickerfield was known for its charm, quaint cottages with creaky floorboards, a bakery that made the best pumpkin muffins, and a community that thrived on traditions both silly and sinister. Every autumn, as the leaves turned a crisp orange and the air filled with the scent of cinnamon, the townspeople gathered for the ritual of decay. They claimed it was to keep the ancient spirit of Ezekiel the rotting at bay, a duty passed down through generations. Most treated it as a harmless quirk of local lore, but not Jake Mulligan. Jake was the kind of guy who wore his cynicism like a well-worn jacket. At 32, he had the charm of a golden retriever mixed with the attitude of a cat that just knocked over a houseplant. His days were spent rummaging through the dusty archives of the Wickerfield Historical Society, often making snide remarks about the oddities of small-town life. This year, however, the ritual of decay would take a turn that no one, least of all Jake, could have anticipated. The sun had barely risen on the day of the festival, and Jake was already nursing a hangover from the previous night's escapades. He had lost a bet to his friend Stan, who insisted that Jake dress as the town's legendary rotting hero. Thus, he found himself squeezed into a greenish costume that looked suspiciously like it had been borrowed from a rejected horror movie. With a costume that resembled a moldy cabbage, Jake set off toward the church, where the rituals were held. As he trudged through the town square, he overheard snippets of conversation. "Did you hear? Old Mrs. Bartholomew's cat went missing again," someone said, while another chimed in, "I swear, if we forget the ritual this year, we'll all be cursed." Jake chuckled to himself. Cursed? Maybe they'd just be stuck with an inconveniently large rat problem. Upon arriving at the church, he was greeted by the sight of townsfolk bustling around with offerings of fruits, vegetables, and an array of absurdly large candles. The air buzzed with excitement, a mixture of nervousness and glee. Jake spotted his friend, Stan, and sauntered over, feeling particularly ridiculous. "Nice costume, Jake," Stan laughed, his eyes twinkling. "You look like a salad that rolled down a hill." "Thanks," Jake replied dryly. "I was going for most regrettable decision of the year, but I think I've nailed it." The rituals began with the town's mayor, a portly man named Mayor Blanchard, who boomed into a microphone, "Welcome, dear citizens. Today, we gather to appease our beloved Ezekiel, the guardian of Wickerfield." Jake rolled his eyes as the townsfolk clapped enthusiastically. They all believed that every year, they needed to perform the ritual to keep Ezekiel's spirit contained in the church's basement. It was an age-old story, one that Jake had debunked numerous times in his articles for the local paper. Still, the townspeople took it seriously, even if the whole affair seemed utterly absurd to him. After the initial speeches, the townsfolk began to chant, circling the church in a well-rehearsed routine. Jake, feeling particularly mischievous, decided to make his way to the basement where the corpse was said to rest. A treasure trove of weird artifacts and dusty old tomes awaited him, and he was determined to see if there was anything worth writing about. Besides, who wouldn't want to see the local celebrity up close? As he slipped away from the festivities, Jake found the basement door slightly ajar. His heart raced with a mix of excitement and apprehension. The basement smelled of damp earth and something vaguely like old cheese. He pushed the door open wider, and the hinges creaked like they were protesting his entry. Inside, the room was dimly lit, revealing rows of dusty shelves crammed with ancient relics, peculiar trinkets, and, at the far end, a large, ornate coffin. "Oh boy," Jake muttered to himself. "What fresh nonsense awaits me in here?" As he approached the coffin, he couldn't help but crack a joke. "If this is where they keep the town's hopes and dreams, I think we should just burn it all." He chuckled, glancing around the room as if the shadows might answer him. Jake gingerly lifted the lid of the coffin, fully expecting to be greeted by nothing more than a pile of old bones or a grotesque mannequin. But instead, he was met with a sight that nearly made him jump back. A grotesque, mummified figure lay inside, dressed in tattered priestly robes that looked like they belonged in a horror flick. The corpse was unnervingly preserved, with a face that seemed to be caught between a bemused grin and a perpetual scowl. "What in the name of all that is holy is this?" Jake whispered, leaning closer for a better look. The figure was adorned with an oversized hat that had definitely seen better days. Looks like you could use a good moisturizer. Before he could catch his breath, he noticed a strange glimmer at the corpse's side. Curious, he reached out and touched it, only to find a small, intricately carved amulet that pulsed with an odd energy. What's this? A charm to ward off bad fashion choices, he mused, slipping it into his pocket. Just as he turned to leave, the air around him shifted. The room felt charged, buzzing like static electricity. Jake glanced back at the corpse, an involuntary shiver creeping down his spine. The townsfolk's chants echoed faintly in the background, but they were becoming distorted, almost mocking, and then, with a sudden jolt, the corpse's eyes flew open, revealing hollow sockets filled with darkness. Ezekiel, the rotting, had come to life. Well, this is awkward, Jake said, attempting to play it cool even as he felt his heart race. I didn't mean to disturb your beauty sleep. Ezekiel sat up slowly, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, like a marionette whose strings had tangled. Who dares disturb my eternal rest? He groaned, his voice echoing as though it came from the depths of a tomb. Just your friendly neighborhood historian, Jake stammered, stepping back. I was just, checking in on you. Checking in? Ezekiel replied, his voice laced with a mix of annoyance and curiosity. You're the first to do so in centuries. Most just leave me to rot, literally. Jake couldn't help but snicker. Well, it looks like you've got a bit of a decay problem there, my friend. Ezekiel narrowed his eyes, still adjusting to the world around him. And who are you to judge my condition? I have my reasons for this state. He gestured at his decaying body, a hint of indignation in his tone. I was once a revered figure, a protector of this town. Jake raised an eyebrow. A protector? More like a really bad fashion statement. Ezekiel seemed to contemplate this for a moment. I do miss the days when I was revered. Now I'm just a forgotten relic. It's rather disheartening. Well, you can't blame them, Jake replied, crossing his arms. I mean, who wants to worship a guy who looks like he lost a fight with a compost heap? Suddenly, the basement door burst open, and in rushed Stan, panting heavily. Jake! There you are. We thought you'd gotten lost in the... He froze, his eyes wide as he took in the sight of the reanimated Ezekiel. What the hell is happening? Oh, just a friendly chat with our local corpse, Jake said nonchalantly. The usual. Ezekiel glared at them both. Am I to be ignored in my time of resurrection? I have needs, Jake grinned at Stan. Well, this is going to make for an interesting festival, don't you think? The chaos that ensued was nothing short of spectacular. As they hurriedly retreated from the basement, Ezekiel, now fully aware of his surroundings, lumbered after them, leaving behind a trail of decomposing fabric and bewilderment. Jake couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. Who would have thought that today's ritual of decay would include a live-action encounter with the town's infamous spirit? Outside, the festival had reached its peak. The townsfolk were still chanting, but their fervor shifted as they caught sight of Ezekiel. Panic spread like wildfire, sending the crowd into a frenzy. The rotting is free. Run for your lives, someone screamed, while others scrambled to grab their ceremonial offerings as if they could ward off the decaying figure. Wow, way to make an entrance. Jake shouted over the chaos, glancing back at Ezekiel. Maybe tone it down a bit? Ezekiel, utterly unfazed, looked at Jake with newfound determination. You may have unwittingly released me, but I'm not here to haunt. I need to find a new host, or I will fade back into oblivion. Jake's mind raced. A host? You mean like a new vessel? Ezekiel interrupted, his eyes glimmering with excitement. Someone who can appreciate my unique qualities. Yeah, but do you really want to spend eternity in someone else's body? What if they have bad hygiene? Jake shot back, already regretting his decision to engage. Before they could debate the finer points of possession, the townsfolk had rallied. They grabbed makeshift weapons, pitchforks and brooms, brandishing them like they were defending against an army of zombies. "Stand back, foul spirit!" Mayor Blanchard shouted, his voice cracking as he pointed a finger at Ezekiel. "We shall banish you back to your coffin." Jake couldn't help but snicker at the sight. "You've really got to work on your intimidation tactics, Blanchard." Ezekiel, clearly flattered by the attention, raised his hands. "Hold on. I'm not here to harm anyone. I just want to find a new body," the townsfolk echoed in horrified unison. "Exactly," Ezekiel exclaimed. "See, you understand. Look, I'll prove it. I'm more of a reformed spirit now. How about we throw a party instead?" Jake slapped his forehead, caught between laughter and disbelief. "You want to throw a party? Have you seen how they react to you?" The crowd gasped, taking a step back. "He's trying to trick us," someone shouted. "Not at all," Ezekiel insisted, his eyes wide with sincerity. "I just want to be part of the living world again. We can all have fun together." "Sure, why not?" Jake interjected, seizing the moment. "Who doesn't want to dance with a rotting corpse?" The townsfolk paused, uncertainty creeping into their expressions. The absurdity of the situation began to sink in. Maybe they could entertain this idea, even if just for a moment. "All right, everyone," Jake called, taking the lead. "Let's give Ezekiel a chance. I mean, what's the worst that could happen? A few bad dance moves and a lot of laughter?" The crowd, caught off guard, exchanged glances. Laughter bubbled up among them, slowly transforming the panic into reluctant curiosity. "Fine," Mayor Blanchard said, lowering his pitchfork. "But only if he promises to behave." "I promise," Ezekiel replied, a mischievous grin creeping across his decaying face. "Now, let's dance." And so, against all odds, the ritual of decay transformed from a solemn occasion into a hilarious, chaotic celebration. As music played and laughter rang out, Jake couldn't help but marvel at the unexpected turn of events. Who knew that a day meant to appease a rotting corpse would turn into a festival celebrating the quirks of life, death, and everything in between? As the music blared from the makeshift speakers, the townsfolk cautiously stepped back into the square, initially unsure of what to make of their resurrected guest. Ezekiel, in all his decayed glory, began to sway to the rhythm, his movements both awkward and strangely graceful, as though he were rediscovering the joy of movement after centuries of stillness. "Come on, folks. Let's celebrate life," Jake shouted over the pulsing beat, his voice infused with a contagious enthusiasm. "And what better way to do it than with our very own ghostly figure?" The tension in the air shifted as laughter rippled through the crowd. Slowly, people began to join in, stepping out of their comfort zones. An elderly woman with a twinkle in her eye grabbed her husband's hand and started a hesitant two-step, while a group of teenagers, emboldened by the ridiculousness of it all, attempted a coordinated dance that resembled a blend of flailing and exaggerated hip-hop moves. "See?" Jake nudged Stan, who stood beside him, wide-eyed and slack-jawed. "What did I tell you? Just add a little humor, and you can turn anything around." "Yeah, but I didn't expect the festival to be a dance-off with a corpse," Stan replied, shaking his head in disbelief yet unable to suppress a grin. "Hey, it's Wickerfield," Jake said, waving his arms to the beat. "Anything can happen here." Ezekiel, now fully embracing his role as the life of the party, began to call out dance moves. To the left. Now to the right. Feel the decay in your bones. His voice echoed with a ghoulish enthusiasm that only seemed to encourage the crowd. "What kind of dance is that?" a skeptical townsman shouted, crossing his arms, but even he couldn't help but smile as he watched Ezekiel's antics. "It's called the rotting shuffle," Ezekiel declared with a flourish, launching into a hilariously exaggerated series of shuffles and twirls that had the crowd in stitches. "Anyone can do it. Just let your limbs be as loose as mine." Jake jumped in, mimicking Ezekiel's movements, and the crowd erupted in laughter. Soon, they were all shuffling and twirling, the atmosphere charged with a mix of disbelief and glee. The seriousness of the ritual of decay faded into the background, overshadowed by the sheer joy of dancing with a corpse. Who would have thought? Stan mused, glancing around at the colorful scene. A dance party with a dead priest. This is going to be the highlight of my life. "Don't get too attached," Jake said, laughing as he sidestepped a little girl dressed as a pumpkin who was trying to spin her grandmother around. "I hear he's looking for a host." "Like a new best friend?" Stan teased, nudging Jake. "More like a new body," Ezekiel chimed in, dramatically pretending to clutch his rotting heart. "But I think I'm starting to like it here." As the hours passed, the sun dipped low, casting a warm glow over the town square. The festival transformed into a colorful spectacle of costumes, laughter, and the peculiar sight of Ezekiel leading the townsfolk in increasingly outrageous dance moves. A local band, inspired by the spectacle, even jumped in, playing a catchy tune that perfectly complemented the spirit of the evening. In a moment of spontaneity, Jake grabbed a microphone from the stage. "All right, Wickerfield. How about a round of applause for our special guest, Ezekiel?" Cheers erupted from the crowd, drowning out the music for a moment. Ezekiel, visibly moved, gave a mock bow, causing his decaying hat to slip over his eyes. Thank you. I've missed the applause. It's the only thing that keeps me from rotting away." The crowd roared with laughter, and Jake could hardly believe how the day had turned around. What had started as a festival of dread had morphed into a celebration of life, decay, and everything in between. In the midst of the festivities, Jake noticed a figure lurking at the edge of the crowd. It was Margaret, the town's infamous busybody, who had always been skeptical of the legend surrounding Ezekiel. Her arms were crossed, and her brow furrowed with disapproval, but as she caught sight of the laughter and revelry, her expression softened. "Maybe this isn't so terrible after all," she muttered under her breath, inching closer to the dance floor, drawn in by the infectious energy. "Come on, Margaret. Join us," Jake called out, waving her over. "You'll regret it if you don't." With a reluctant sigh, Margaret pushed her glasses up her nose and took a tentative step forward, then another, until she found herself caught up in the rhythm, clapping along with the crowd. As the night deepened, the revelry continued. Jake, feeling buoyed by the atmosphere, turned to Ezekiel, who had settled down for a moment, watching the festivities with an expression of pure delight. "You know, this is really something," Jake said, leaning closer. "You were supposed to be terrifying, but look at you now. You've become the town's favorite attraction." Ezekiel chuckled, though it came out as a raspy wheeze. Who knew all it took was a little humor and a bit of life to turn a decaying priest into a party legend? Jake smiled, realizing that maybe there was a lesson hidden within this chaos. Life, much like the festival, was unpredictable, messy, and often required embracing the absurdity to truly enjoy it. "Let's just hope they don't decide to lock you back up next year," Jake said, half joking. "Oh, I'd fight them," Ezekiel replied, puffing out his chest. "I'd stage a dance revolution." The night wound on, laughter blending with music and the crisp fall air. The townsfolk eventually settled down, forming a circle around the makeshift stage, where Stan had volunteered to share a few embarrassing stories about Jake and their escapades through the years. Once, Jake tried to impress a girl by doing a backflip off a diving board, Stan began, and laughter erupted as he recounted the incident in exaggerated detail. As the festivities came to an end, the townsfolk began to drift away, still buzzing from the excitement of the night. Jake stood with Ezekiel, both of them watching as the last of the decorations were taken down and the final songs played. "Thank you for this," Ezekiel said, his voice softening. "I never thought I'd experience life again, even if just for a night." "It was a group effort," Jake replied, clapping Ezekiel on the back. "You brought everyone together. You reminded us that sometimes, it's okay to embrace the weirdness of life." "And death," Ezekiel added with a cheeky grin, causing Jake to laugh. As the last lights flickered off, Jake turned to leave, a sense of fulfillment washing over him. The ritual of decay had transformed from a chilling legend into a memory filled with laughter, dance, and camaraderie. "Hey, Jake!" Stan called from a distance, waving him over. "You're not going to believe what they want to do next year." Jake chuckled, already bracing himself for whatever absurd idea the town might dream up next. "Let's just hope it doesn't involve more rotting corpses." Ezekiel, still lingering behind, chuckled at that. "Oh, I wouldn't bet against it. After all, I'm sure I could convince a few of my old friends to join the fun." Jake turned back to Ezekiel, both of them bursting into laughter at the thought. "You might just be right. Wickerfield isn't done with you yet." As they walked away from the now empty square, Jake felt a renewed sense of connection to the town and its strange traditions. Embracing the peculiarities of life and death, and the bond he had formed with a rotting priest, had opened his eyes to the beauty of the unexpected. In the end, they were all part of a grand story, woven together by laughter, friendship, and a little bit of decay, and thus, the ritual of decay found its place not just in the hearts of the townsfolk, but as a reminder that even the most peculiar traditions could breathe new life into an old story. As the last echoes of laughter faded into the night, Jake knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't trade this bizarre, beautiful town for anything in the world. With that thought, he stepped into the night, ready to embrace whatever the next adventure might bring.